So today, the history of beer and brewing in Rochester, and here to give our talk today are Christine Radarski, our city historian and the director of Central Library Local History and Genealogy Division, and also Paul Constantine, the retail manager and brewhouse curator of the Genesee Brewing Company. So we'll call Christine up first, and thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. When I was asked to do this talk, I came into it not knowing a whole lot about brewing in Rochester, and so this has been a learning experience for me. And I think as Paul and I have been sitting here talking, I think we've realized that there's an awful lot to know and to say about brewing in Rochester. So we both may be needing to cut our remarks a little short in order to get through this all today. But, alcohol has been produced in our flower city almost from the very start. The first distillery is said to have opened in Rochester in 1815, and most early settlers preferred that hard stuff. But there were a handful of Germans among our earliest settlers here, and it didn't take long for them to start producing their preferred beverage, too. The first known brewery was the Aqueduct Springs Brewery, which opened in 1819. It operated along the east bank of the Genesee River, just north of Main Street. And that's the area that today would be the Genesee Crossroads Park, back behind the area that's the Rochester Plaza Hotel. There's not a lot that's known about this brewery. It was fairly short-lived, and there's not a lot of documentation about it. But shortly after the Aqueduct Springs started, a competitor, Nathan Lyman, opened his own brewery near Central Avenue and St. Paul Street in the district that we now know as our brewing district. This operation met with a little more success. Lyman continued to operate it until 1844, when the firm was sold to Samuel Warren, and it became known as the City Springs Brewery. Warren and eventually his sons remained in that business until 1904, so it was a pretty long operating business. Another early and successful brewery opened in that same year, in the same year that the former village of Rochester became the city of Rochester, 1834. John and Gabriel Longmuir began brewing at 80 to 93 Water Street. And that firm changed ownership several times before finally closing in 1912. So we can see that we have a long history of brewing with very early breweries and very long-lasting breweries. And as we talk, you'll see that we had several breweries operating in the city with, more than half-century-long histories. As the city's German population increased, so did the city's proclivity for beer. When the Longmuirs started their business in 1834, Germans made up only about 2.5% of the United States population. But after the failed March Revolution in the German states in 1848 and 1849, the number of immigrants grew quickly. By 1855, almost 15% of the U.S. population was German, and beer production increased almost as rapidly as the population. And Rochester was an ideal location for beer production. Not only did the city boast a large German population who provided excellent workers for malt houses, the limestone banks of our Genesee River provided ideal facilities, an ideal location for the development of large underground fermentation tanks. Among the first brewers of this expansion period after German population began to increase was Louis Bauer. He opened a brewery on Lyle Avenue in 1849, and his firm would eventually become known as the Rochester Ale Company, and it continued in operation until 1879. So some of our other early brewers included George Marburger, who brewed on Clinton Street and operated until 1882, Henry Kondrolf, Louis Hoff, Joseph Nunn. All of these were early brewers, and they were known for the ales that they produced in the community. There were 4 of the earliest Rochester breweries that survived for well over a half a century and continued to operate successfully until Prohibition was enacted in 1920. These included Flower City Brewing, American Brewing, Genesee Brewing, and Bartholomae Brewing. Rochester Brewing was established somewhat later in 1874, but it also survived until Prohibition. So a little bit about some of these long-running companies. Frederick Miller opened a brewery at Lake Avenue and Brown Street until 1851. And I travel Lake Avenue every day and I never realized that Lake Avenue had been a center for brewing for much of our history, too. Frederick Miller's firm would prove to be quite successful and sustainable, although it did undergo several name changes through the years. In 1881, it became known as the Miller Brewing Company, and then in 1902, it became the Flower City Brewing Company. Christian Myers and Frederick Loebs began brewing on Hudson Avenue in 1855, and that firm would also be very long-lived, becoming the American Brewing Company in 1889. In the same year that Myers and Loebs was established in 1855, Jacob Rouse started his brewery business on St. Paul Street. And I'm going to leave it to Paul to give you more details about Rouse's business, which would grow to become part of the Genesee Brewing Company. I mention it here because it was among the three major pre-Prohibition breweries, alongside Flower City and American, that would close when the Volstead Act took effect in 1920, but it would reopen in some form upon repeal of the law in 1933. Interesting, most of these brewers were German, but we did have one Irishman brewing in our city quite early as well. Patrick Enright began producing beer at 149 Mill Street near Factory Street in 1861, and he became well known for his quality ales, allowing the company to prosper until 1907. And the final two companies that I want to mention are the Bartholomae Brewing Company and the Rochester Brewing Company, both of which were notable for their scale early on. In 1852, Henry Bartholomae and Philip Will founded a brewery operated under both their names and produced the first special fermented beer. And Paul tells me that this is what we would know today as a lager. Prior to that, all of the beers produced in our city were ales. And as I just learned through this process, the difference between the two lies in the fermentation process. So lagers are fermented at lower temperatures over a longer period of time than ales. And there's also a difference in the way that the fermentation process takes place, with one being a top fermenting process and one a bottom fermenting process. And I can't recall right now which is which. The lager is the top? Ale is the top, lager is the bottom. Thank you. In 1874, the Bartholomew Company was reorganized, and rather than operating under the Bartholomew and Will's name, it became the Bartholomew Brewing Company. And at that point, production increased significantly. They went from 3,000 barrels a year to 125,000 barrels. They also built a new malt house that had a capacity of 25,000 barrels, and it was considered one of the largest and best equipped breweries in the United States. It occupied 6 acres along the Genesee River and had the largest ice house in New York State. By the mid-1880s, Bartholomew was employing 130 people in jobs ranging from coopers, brewerymen, plumbers, and carters. And they added an additional 100 laborers every year just during the ice harvest season. Bartholomew is also notable for being the first in our area to introduce a new ice-making system that allowed them to supplement the natural ice from the river with a man-made ice production system when the harvest season came at a time when perhaps there wasn't a lot of ice. In the same year as Bartholomew's reorganization and expansion, the Rochester Brewing Company was founded off Lake Avenue. It produced 12,000 barrels in its first year, and by 1883, annual sales were 72,000 barrels that were worth more than $500,000 a year. So not quite as large as Bartholomew, but still doing pretty well. And that company employed 100 people on its 7 acres. And its cellars could hold 45,000 barrels, and they were actually considered the best in the city, even better than Bartholomew's. In 1889, the city's 3 largest brewers, Bartholomew, Rochester, and Genesee, and a few of the smaller malt houses, were consolidated by an outside syndicate to become part of the larger Bartholomew Brewing Company of Rochester. And this is an interesting process that I really need to delve a little bit more into to fully understand. But under this conglomeration, the individual breweries continued to keep their own identity identities and to continue to operate largely independently, so that at the time of Prohibition, they were still known by their individual names, and many of them, as we'll see, actually came back into production as their own companies once Prohibition was repealed. Now, there were at least 7 breweries operating in Rochester in 1919 when the 18th Amendment banned the production, sale, and transportation of most alcohol. These included Bartholomae, Monroe Brewing Company, Charles Weinman, Genesee Brewing Company, the Morlbach Brewing Company, Flower City Brewing Company, and American Brewing Company. 2 Rochester brewers, including Bartholomae, actually were able to transfer their operations from brewing to dairying operations during Prohibition. So they were able to continue operating as dairy industries through Prohibition. And a few others actually converted production to a malt beverage that was below the alcoholic limit. But most of our breweries shut down during Prohibition. Opposition to alcoholic beverages was nothing new to Rochester. By 1919, when Prohibition took effect, there had been a long-standing history of opposition to alcohol here in Rochester, beginning with the Temperance Movement, which had been quite active in our city, dating to settlement, actually. As early as 1827, the Rochester Presbytery had resolved that church members should avoid and discourage even, quote, temperate use of ardent spirits. In 1829, when the famous daredevil Sam Patch died in his attempt to jump over the high falls, clergymen such as Josiah Bissell lamented the state of drunkenness he found in our village. And historian Paul Johnson noted that in 1828, there had been 100 liquor licenses granted in our city and 100 more in 1829. At that time, there was 1 tavern for every 28 men living in the village. Yeah. And together, the bars served about 20,000 gallons of whiskey a year at that point. So temperance advocates called these taverns, quote, pauper factories, and they urged Rochester's Common Council to stop issuing liquor licenses, arguing that it was equivalent to, quote, licensing persons to make paupers and to prepare men for the commission of crime, and levying taxes for building poorhouses and jails. And it was such an issue that our first mayor of the city, Jonathan Childs, resigned his position rather than issue more liquor licenses. So that was the reason Jonathan Child left office. After Sam Patch's death in 1829, there was a 6-month visit by itinerant evangelist preacher Charles Grandison Finney, well connected with the Great Awakening. Finney stayed in Rochester for 6 months in 1830 and preached widely throughout the community. And, he had an effect on our city, and we saw that within that year's time period, in 1830, there had been, in 1829, 12 grocers on the east side of the river who had been selling alcohol. Within a year, only 6 of them were still selling alcohol. Now, this early temperance movement, of course, focused on hard liquor, but when Germans began immigrating and there became more of a focus on beer production in our city, the temperance advocates shifted their focus to address beer as well. This anti-alcohol movement continued through the Civil War, and the National Prohibition Party was founded in 1869, followed within 4 years by the development of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was largely a women's organization founded in 1873 to push for temperance and ultimately prohibition. Its second president, Frances Willard, was actually from the Rochester area. She was born in Churchville, so you can see how our area was highly involved in the temperance movement. This movement grew stronger throughout the 19th century and gained momentum into the 20th century. The Prohibition Union of Christian Men of Rochester was typical. Founded in 1897 at Lake Avenue Baptist Church, the secretary reported after just the first year that they had held 46 mass meetings in the year and ended with a membership of 464 members. They had begun a year earlier with only 34 members, so the movement grew incredibly. The president of that organization compared the movement to a war and argued that the organization would not give up until that war was won. Quote, 5 years or 50 years, we will never let up until we redeem this town from the curse of rum. The saloon is made possible by law. The modern saloon is a creature of law. When it is killed, it will be killed by law. The law can be secured only through political action. And indeed, that's what took place. And that gained momentum particularly around World War I. With the war being fought in Europe, there was a need to preserve grain to feed the troops. And so the idea of prohibition became much more palpable in relationship to this need to serve our troops. And so during the end of the war, there was this big push for prohibition. Ironically, the Prohibition Amendment was not actually passed until the war had ended, and it didn't go into effect until 1920, but it was largely connected with the war. The 18th Amendment was enacted on January 16th, it was passed on January 16th of 1919. It didn't go into effect until January of 1920. So as I mentioned, that amendment banned the sale, production, importation, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. So as you might note, it took a great effect on our local breweries. During the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, saw the need to create more jobs and saw brewing as a potential means of doing that. And so he fought for the repeal of Prohibition, which eventually occurred with the amendment, the 21st Amendment in 1933. And he had actually passed a law prior to that that allowed sale of alcohol with a content of 3.2% that went into effect shortly before Prohibition was repealed. So the repeal of Prohibition brought the industry to life again in Rochester, at least for a time. When Prohibition was repealed in April of 1933, several Rochester breweries reopened, but only a few lasted more than a few years. So there were about 5 that I have identified that were actually reopened. The Cataract Brewing Company operated through Prohibition as one of the breweries producing malt beverages, producing from 1928 to 1940. Flower City Brewing Company reopened, but only for a year. E.M. Higgins Company operated for just a year. The Malt Brew Company and Bartholomae Brewing, ironically one of our biggest and most successful brewers prior to Prohibition, had operated throughout Prohibition as a dairy industry, but was unable to succeed in brewing again following Prohibition. In 1940, 4 breweries remained. At that time, they employed 460 people and turned out an average of 900,000 barrels annually. And these consisted of the American Brewing Company, the Rochester Brewing Company, the Standard Brewing Company, and the Genesee Brewing Company. And eventually 2 of those, the Rochester and Standard Brewing Companies, would merge in 1956 to become the Rochester Standard, and they operated until 1970. American shut down in 1950, and so that leaves us with 1 remaining brewery today, the Genesee Brewing Company, which Paul will provide you with more history of. So thank you.
Okay, folks, thanks for coming out today. I want to start off, I just want to thank Rebecca for inviting us this afternoon, and I want to thank Christine for that. It was a great overview of the city's history. And also, I want to make a point, too, of thank you for, you're very generous. When I was getting the Brewhouse Project off the ground, you're very generous with your time and offering some guidance and some suggestions. I really appreciate it. Really went a long way to helping me get the place off the ground a little bit. So yeah, I'm here to talk specifically about the Genesee Brewery's history. And well, you know, the Genesee Brewery was established in 1878, and that makes it not only the oldest brewery existing in town now, but the oldest brewery in the state and among the oldest in the entire country. Now, the brewery was established in 1878, but really brewing on the site goes back a bit farther than that. As Christine mentioned, it was 1855 when a brewery was established there, and in 1857 that brewery was taken over by Charles Rao, and over the next 20 years or so that brewery changed hands or went through partnership rearrangements until it was purchased in 1878 by Hendry Condolph's son Matthias, and it was Matthias who named the brewery Genesee And with the exception of the Prohibition years, there's been a Genesee on St. Paul Street ever since. Now, as Christine mentioned, Condoff owned the brewery until 1889. That's when an English syndicate bought Genesee, the Rochester Brewery, and Bartholomae, the largest in the city. But Condoff stayed on as the brewery's president, with each brewery operating independently under their own name. Condoff stayed on as Genesee's president. Incidentally, Condoff later moved on in 1908. He established the Moorbach Brewery Company, and that's the one that later became the post-Prohibition Rochester Brewing Company that later merged with Standard. Now, at about the time of that ownership change that occurred in '89, a gentleman named John Whaley went to work for Bartholomae as a brewer. And Bartholomae had an industrious and ambitious son named Lewis. And Lewis felt the responsibility to help support the family. And as such, he went to work helping out his dad around the brewery. And he later recalled being fascinated by the sights and sounds and smells of the brewery. And he developed a real passion for brewing. And one way or another, he caught the notice of management at Bartholomae, and they sent him on to the National Brewers Academy in New York, where he learned the trade. And 2 years later, he came back and worked as a brewer at Bartholomae. Now, Lewis caught his first big break in 1916 when he was named brewmaster at Genesee, and he stayed there for a couple years before moving on to the Lang Brewery out in Buffalo. Now, with the onset of Prohibition, of course, brewers and breweries had to make some hard decisions and figure out how to survive. As Christine noted, Bartholomae went into dairy goods. Some breweries stayed alive with malt beverages. But unfortunately, Genesee, after a brief fling with selling ice and coal, Genesee did what most breweries did at the time, and we shut down altogether. Now, at the same time, brewers needed to find ways to survive, to go into different lines of work. And Lewis Whaley was no exception. He went into, he worked briefly as a grocer, and then he went to the baking business. And eventually he owned bakeries here in Rochester. He owned one in Buffalo, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Youngstown, Ohio as well. And he was fabulously successful. What set him apart was he specialized in the home delivery of baked goods. And as I said, he was extremely excited, with one little exception. In Milwaukee, it turns out, folks enjoyed meeting at the brewery early in the day, and it was a chance for them to get together and touch base and maybe gossip a little bit. So there wasn't much call for that specialized service of home delivery in Milwaukee. It was the one exception to Whaley's success, and he later noted that as a valuable lesson on the importance of intimately knowing your market. And he said it served him well later on in his brewing concerns. And Lewis Whaley was an interesting man. He was very civic-minded. He had a lot of outside interests away from the brewery. Later in life, he headed up the state's March of Dimes campaign. He briefly served as the chairman of the state's Environmental Conservation Department. For a time, he was the chairman of the state's Republican Party, and this picture of him with President Truman dates from that time. And he was friendly with FDR. And in spite of all his success in the baking, his heart really lay in brewing. And in an unpublished autobiography he wrote shortly before he passed away in 1964, Whaley noted that he had an inkling that Prohibition was coming to an end. And however he arrived at that inkling, whatever help he might have had with that, time proved him right. He sold off his interests in the bakery, and he sold to Hathaway Baking Company, and started to take steps to breathe life into his old home at Genesee. He gathered up other investors. He bought out the equipment from a defunct Kansas City brewery, and set about having Genesee ready to go when in fact Prohibition had run its course. And you got to recall, it wasn't just brewers that were out of work at this time. You know, it was coopers and bottlers and ice house workers, and all sorts of assorted associated industries were hurt by the removal of the brewing industry. So yeah, FDR asked Congress to redefine exactly what constituted an intoxicating beverage, and they followed suit. They raised the allowable limit from half of 1% to 3.2%. Pretty mild stuff still by our standards today, but at least brewers were able to get the barrel rolling again. And within 3 weeks of that adjustment, Genesee was ready to go. That's Mr. Whaley at the microphone at the Powers Hotel on the night of April 27th, 1933. And it was a cold, rainy night, but thousands of people showed up it was kind of an overwhelming crowd in his recollection, showed up to celebrate the return of, well, the Genesee's Liebitschner Ale, their flagship lager. It was advertised as the beer you didn't forget. The Old Stratford Ale was back. Later that year, the iconic 12-horse ale was introduced. And that crowd that showed up kind of foreshadowed the brewery's the success that was to come. It was kind of an overnight success. That first year alone, production exceeded even the ever-optimistic Whaley's estimation by some 10,000 barrels. Now, the coming decades were the era of the regional brewer, and Genesee managed to establish itself as one of the strongest regional brewers in the country. We had a prominent presence not only here in New York, but also Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Massachusetts. And I think a big reason for the success was that the brewery was always, and management always had an eye on the quality of focus was always put on the quality of the product. And to that end, Genesee was always equipped with the biggest and the brightest, the biggest and the most state-of-the-art equipment available. What we have pictured here is a bottling line that was installed in 1952. At the time, it was the fastest bottling line in the world. It was capable of filling 305 bottles a minute. Later on, Genesee boasted the largest lauter ton in the world, and it's about the mid-60s or so. So, yeah, the brewery was always, again, that focus was on quality, and brewery always had the newest and best of everything. I think it's more to it than that, though. There's a little more to Genesee's success than just the quality of the product. With working on this project, the Brewhouse Project, I should say, you got to talk a lot of people about the beer, about the brand and what the name Genesee means to them. And I was struck by there's a real affinity in the city and in the community for the name Genesee, and more so than I really even expected to find. And I thought about it, and I was trying to figure out exactly what it was. And, well, first of all, I think it's a good product. We've always put out pretty darn good beer. But in talking to old employees at the brewery, there was a real feeling of family there. Even today, it's not uncommon for us. A lot of people at the brewery had fathers or grandfathers who worked at the brewery. One longtime employee told me about how the Whaleys went out of their way to hire veterans out of World War II. And there was always this sense that the Whaleys really cared about the people who were making careers out of investing themselves in the brewery's success. And I think that feeling extends beyond the brewery as well. One of the best parts of my job is interacting with people on a daily basis. We hear all the time, geez, this place brings back a lot of memories. And we grew up with Genesee. My dad always had a Genesee at the family picnics, or somebody will tell me, yeah, my cream ale was my first beer. My uncle slipped me a cream ale when I was 17. And I think it's the nature of the product. We laugh with beer, we celebrate with beer, we cry with beer. For some, it's a rite of passage. I'm sure a lot of you here today are here because you enjoy a good glass of beer, or maybe you just want to hear about one of the city's oldest industries, or maybe you have some memories, some fond memories with Genesee somewhere in the picture. And I think that's a big part of the story, is that fondness for the brewery and its association with people's memories. And whether it's nostalgia or the quality of the product, I think it's undeniable Genesee's become a part of the fabric of the region. But anyway, another reason for the success of the brewery was that there was always progressive. The brewery always had a progressive approach. We weren't afraid to try new things. And a couple products I want to mention are, first of all, Trim. Trim was an aptly named beer that came out in the early 1950s. Really what it was a light beer. 25 years before really that light beer came to dominate the market. And of course, Cream Ale came out in 1960. I use this picture because it uses that early slogan, the male ale. I think it hints at the brewery's aim to appeal itself to that masculine, young, next generation, that generation of the future. So it was always a progressive approach at the brewery, I think. Now, upon Lewis Whaley's passing in 1964, Jack Whaley, his son, took over as chairman of the brewery. And for the next 2 or 3 generations, I think Jack Whaley personified the brewery. For years, he and his brother Robert had alternated between serving as president and treasurer under their dad. But by the time of Lewis's passing, Jack took over. And really, he presided over the brewery's heyday. Some of the brewery's biggest success came under Jack Whaley. In the early 1960s, the brewery hit the 1 million barrel mark in production for the first time. In 1974, they hit 2 million barrels. And quickly, not long after that, only in 1978, the brewery hit 3 million barrels produced for the first time. So the brewery was really growing. And this was at a time when the trend in the market was that the bigger brewers were taking on a larger and larger percentage of the market. And one by one, the trend started out slowly at first, but gradually, one by one, a lot of the smaller regional brewers were either getting bought up or going by the wayside. Now, upon Jack Whaley's passing in 1993, his son Ted Whaley took over, and he and the following management group saw the brewery through some of the industry's most challenging times, certainly the darkest times since the time of Prohibition. As I said, bigger brewers were taking over a bigger and bigger share of the market, but other things were happening too. In the 80s, we had the raising of the drinking age, and wine coolers were coming into their own. So that market that was shrinking was, that market that was being dominated by bigger players was increasingly shrinking. But that said, I think it's no exaggeration to say that the brewery wouldn't be here today without the efforts of Ted Whaley and the group that followed. In an effort to modernize the brewery's image, the group, that left to right there, you see Tom Hubbard, John Henderson, Gary Gemmon, and Howard Jacobson. They were leaders of the era that became the High Falls era. In an attempt to modernize the brewery's image, the brewery was named High Falls. And I think the big thing that they did, well, as I said, we probably wouldn't be here today if not for this group. They did resist. They believed in Genesee's future here in Rochester, and they resisted an offer from Stroh's Brewery to purchase the brewery. And in all likelihood, that would have resulted in the brewery shutting down and production being moved somewhere else. But like I said, the industry itself was facing some dark times, but the one silver lining, the one light at the end of the tunnel was the craft beer movement, what we know today as the craft beer movement. From the late 60s on, slowly they gained momentum for interest in old styles of beer. 35, 40 years ago, you went to the grocery store, everybody had Pilsners. You've had that very light, accessible, drinkable style of Pilsner, very light beers. That's pretty much all you could find. Over time, though, there was a growing interest in bigger flavors, old styles, seasonal varieties, and the brewery responded to that. In 1992, we introduced Michael Shea's Irish Amber, an attempt to, and really the brewery's first product since Jenny Light, first really new product since Jenny Light came out in '78. And we did a few variations on that. There was a black and tan and a blonde ale, but then in '94, the brewery introduced Honey Brown, and that really took off. That was probably the brewery's biggest shot in the arm since Cream Ale came out back in 1960. And it was the High Falls group that committed to the expansion of what we call now our Dundee line of different seasonal offerings and other new products. They weren't afraid to try new things. But despite all their efforts, things remained extremely challenging at the brewery, and quite frankly, the brewery's it came to a point where the brewery's very existence came into question. In 2009, though, an investment group from New York, KPS, purchased Genesee and immediately set about trying to revitalize the brewery and its image. Right away, $10 million was invested in improving process and equipment at the brewery. And under CEO Rich Lozniak, the brewery saw a real renaissance. And we did all kinds of things to get the brewery's get the brewery back in the public's consciousness and then raise its profile. Little things like the lighting of the switching back on of the light over the brewery. They've been dark for something like 40 years. The new paint job. We held outdoor concerts and the opening of the Brewhouse itself. All these things. We brought back 12-horse ale, and then the stubby bottles, those old retro stubby bottles. All kinds of things were done to kind of, bring the brewery back, bring it back in the public's notice. And these things worked. By the summer of 2012, production and employment at the brewery had virtually doubled from where it was in 2009. So it's been, like I said, a real renaissance there at the brewery. Now, the last chapter in the story, or the most recent chapter, I should say, is that later in 2012, the brewery was purchased by Florida Ice and Farm Company, the Costa Rican producer of Imperial Lager. But the commitment is still there. The emphasis is still on the heritage, Genesee's heritage and its deep roots. And efforts are being made to make sure that the brewery remains as big a part of the community as it ever has been. CEO Chris Sergio kicked off just a few months ago the Tap It Forward program you may have heard about, which is designed to raise funds for various charitable organizations through the sale of our house beers, our Brewhouse beers being sold in other facilities, and also different selected brewery products. Under that Tap It Forward program, proceeds from all that are going to local charities. And also at the Brewhouse itself, we've raised at this point almost $100,000 for various charities through the sale of our tasting flights, our beer samples. That commitment's there. The brewery is very much invested in the community and trying to be as big a part of it as we can. And it's an exciting time to be a part of brewing in general. There's a real renaissance in the entire industry. There's a real comeback in the entire industry, and Rochester is indicative of that. According to Brewers, the American Brewers Association, in July of last year, there were 3,000 breweries operating across the entire country. That's the highest number there's been since at least the 1880s. To illustrate what happened with the industry, Rochester alone at one time had 24 breweries operating. And we hit our low point in 1978 when there were only 89 working in the entire country. So, it's been quite a comeback from that low point just over 35 years ago. And it's exciting to be a part of it. There's a real vibrant brewing community here. The Rohrbox has been in business for they're over 2 decades now. They've been wonderfully successful. Swiftwater Brewing Company is just the latest, just opened up a couple weeks ago. It sounds like they're off to a really great start. So it's really exciting to be a part of this whole thing. And for me, it's a kick to be a part of the brewery that really has the deepest roots. That's roots stretch back to the country's first brewing heydays of the early to mid 19th century, one of only 18 that have survived since the Prohibition era, one that has become a part of the community, part of the fabric of the community, and one that I believe is poised to remain so for generations to come. So thanks again for coming out. Ed is